Welcome, everyone. Today, we'll dive into the complex and fascinating process of creating Cambodia's 1993 constitution, a process that emerged from a long legacy of conflict, history, and international interventions.
That's quite something. A constitution born out of peace building after decades of turmoil. What exactly were the key moments in this process?
Well, the process essentially began after the Paris Agreements paved the way for elections, which, by the way, were organized under UN supervision, specifically through UNTAC. The agreement required free and fair elections, and then the elected Constituent Assembly was supposed to draft the constitution that would lay the foundation for a liberal democracy. It's interesting because its origin was not just political but also steeped in historical influences from the Khmer Rouge period, colonial legacies, and even ancient traditions from the Khmer Empire.
So it sounds like the process was meant to be inclusive and transformative, but was it truly transparent?
That's a great question. The process, in theory, was designed to instill democratic principles, including extensive human rights provisions. However, in practice, the drafting was highly secretive.
Right.
A select drafting committee worked mostly behind closed doors, and external groups like NGOs, the press, and even Buddhist clergy had only limited participation. This secrecy ultimately meant that while the final product had a blueprint for democracy on paper, there was a significant gap when it came to actual public participation.
And I imagine that led to some tension. How did those external groups, particularly civil society organizations, react?
They were, quite vocally disappointed. Groups like Ponlo Khmer even sent a letter arguing that the drawing up of the Constitution is not a secret thing. They wanted an open process where every citizen had the right to question what was being included.
Yeah, I can see that.
Their push was for real accountability and transparency, yet the political factions dominated, and the assembly essentially followed instructions from the CPP and FUNCINPEC leaders.
Interesting. It seems that there was a clear tension between the lofty goals of democratic empowerment and the realities of elite power politics. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The constitutional drafting, while it incorporated language referring to liberal democracy and human rights, drawing on international norms and even comparisons with Western models, was really a product of elite negotiation. It essentially merged elements from the 1947 monarchical constitution and the 1989 de facto SOC constitution. That synthesis reflected both a compromise and a reflection of the existing power structures.
So one could say that even with international involvement from the UN and a host of foreign advisors, the domestic political factions effectively controlled the process?
Precisely. UNTAC did a remarkable job in organizing the elections and ensuring a basic level of legitimacy. But when it came to actually managing the constitutional drafting, the UN's role became more formal than substantive. The UN provided guidelines, for example, through Annex 5 of the Paris Agreements, outlining 8 key elements for a liberal democracy. But ultimately, the power over final decisions lay with the Cambodian elites.
I'm curious. What about the influence of Cambodia's historical context? I know that ancient traditions and colonial legacies were also mentioned. How did they come into play?
Yes. Cambodia's history heavily influenced the finally adopted constitution. For starters, there was a strong cultural emphasis on monarchical tradition. The constitution even pays homage to the grandeur of Angkor and Cambodian civilization. At the same time, the legacy of French colonialism contributed to a legal framework that emphasized state sovereignty and aspects of liberal democracy. So, in a way, the document tries to bridge ancient monarchical ideals with contemporary democratic expectations.
That blend sounds ideal on paper, but I wonder, did it actually work in practice, especially when it comes to democratic representation and accountability?
Well, that's where criticisms arise. On one hand, the Constitution established key institutions, parliamentary structures, an independent judiciary in theory, and a Bill of Rights intended to safeguard fundamental freedoms. On the other hand, in practice, Many argue that power remained concentrated in the hands of the dominant political party, namely the CPP. Some observers even labeled the process as just like under communism when it came to the constrained nature of public deliberation. It created a system that, while symbolically democratic, didn't fully empower civil society.
Yeah, I see that point. I read somewhere that there was a sort of respectful debate over whether the restoration of the monarchy would undermine liberal democratic principles. How did that play out in this context?
Oh, that's one of the more fascinating aspects. Prince Sihanouk proposed ideas, even suggestions of a Senate meant for men with white hair, like on Dallas, which sounds almost anecdotal now. Yet clearly his intent was to preserve a traditional role for the monarchy, despite the push for a liberal democracy. In the final constitution, the king holds significant symbolic powers and a few actual powers, but the document deliberately restricts him from governing. Still, many felt that the restoration of the monarchy was part of a political necessity rather than a pure democratic choice.
Some critics might argue that keeping such an influential yet constitutionally constrained monarch blurs the line between traditional authority and modern democratic governance. Would you say that's a fair criticism?
I would. It's a respectful critique that highlights a core tension: the ideals of a liberal democratic state versus the historical and cultural realities of Cambodia. The Constitution tries to ensure that all power belongs to the people through separation of powers, but in reality, the elite control and the legacy of centralized authority, stemming from both the Khmer Rouge's aftermath and the previous regimes, continue to limit true accountability. That tension is still evident today as Cambodia struggles with democratization.
And speaking of democratization, what about the role of public education and participation in this whole process? How did the government and international organizations try to involve the citizenry?
Good question. INTAC, along with various NGOs and even Buddhist monks, launched widespread human rights education campaigns. They disseminated leaflets, used radio and TV programs, and even cartoons to promote constitutional literacy among Cambodians.
That must have been crucial given the low levels of formal democratic
real
experience
participation
among the
in the
populace.
drafting process was minimal. The public wasn't given much say in what was eventually written, so while the outreach created awareness, it didn't translate effectively into genuine influence over the constitutional text.
It makes me wonder if, then, a more participatory, perhaps even a more transparent, process could have resulted in a constitution that better reflected the genuine aspirations of the Cambodian people?
Exactly. In fact, many voices suggest that if UNTAC had insisted on an open process with verbatim public records and more inclusive consultations, the Constitution might have been both more transparent and more democratic in substance.
Yeah, that's a fascinating prospect.
But due to time constraints, political sensitivities, and factional rivalries, the process ended up being, largely elite-driven.
And what were the international repercussions? How did foreign experts and governments influence or react to this process?
Internationally, there was a mix. On one side, experts from France, the United States, and even local legal scholars contributed insights, drawing on experiences from Namibia and elsewhere to help frame the constitutional principles. However, their influence was ultimately curtailed. For instance, prominent U.S. legal advisors were abruptly sidelined once Sihanouk declared that, essentially, no foreigners should direct the drafting once it was underway.
National sovereignty
the UN and international communities, despite their guidelines, ended up with a role that was supportive in theory but quite limited in actual decision-making power in the process.
So, would you say that, overall, the Constitution was more a product of international design criteria imposed by the Paris Agreements and negotiated among Cambodian elites rather than a true grassroots democratic exercise?
Yes, that's a succinct way to put it. The Constitution carries the language of liberal democracy and international human rights norms, but at its core, it's molded by top-down power dynamics. It's like a blueprint that was drafted largely behind closed doors, with the public mainly acting as spectators who later had to live with the consequences of elite bargains.
Yeah, sadly, that seems to be the case. It underscores the challenge of reconciling peace agreements and national reconciliation with genuine democratic renewal. Given all this, what would you say are the lasting impacts of this process on Cambodia's political and legal landscape?
The lasting impact is rather mixed. On the positive side, the Constitution did provide a formal structure for democratic governance, helped bring former warring factions together, and embedded a commitment to human rights. But on the downside, the process exposed deep flaws. The process was opaque, the judiciary remains weak, and power is far too concentrated, leaving limited room for genuine populist input or opposition. The legacy of these elite bargains is still visible in contemporary Cambodian politics, where power remains largely in the hands of those who controlled the drafting process.
It really sounds like the Constitution was a necessary compromise, one that helped transition Cambodia from civil war to a semblance of democracy, but at the same time, left unresolved issues regarding transparency and accountability.
That's absolutely right. It's, a textbook example of how international interventions, while essential for ending brutal conflicts, often end up producing a final product that reflects the complex interplay of history, power, and diplomacy, rather than an idealized form of democracy.
Yep, that's a powerful takeaway. In closing, do you think that a different approach might have led to a stronger constitutional regime positioned for genuine democratic development?
Potentially, yes. If the process had been more inclusive, with open debates, citizen consultation phases, and real efforts to document and publish deliberations, it could have built a more robust foundation for democratic governance. However, given the intense power struggles, time constraints imposed by international donors, and the fragile peace, it would have been an enormous challenge in that particular context. It underlines how peace-building often walks the tightrope between top-down interventions and bottom-up democratic empowerment.
Truly fascinating. And it really shows that constitutional reform in post-conflict societies is never just a legal exercise. It's deeply political and historically contingent.
Exactly. The Cambodian case is a vivid reminder of that reality. Even though the Constitution provides the legal framework for democracy and human rights, the underlying political dynamics and historical legacies continue to challenge its effective implementation.
Indeed, that's a critical point. Thanks for that enlightening discussion. It's been truly engaging to parse through how history, international involvement, and domestic politics intertwine in such a complex process.
Absolutely. It's been great sharing insights on such a multifaceted topic. Hopefully, this conversation inspires us to think more deeply about how constitution-making processes can better bridge the gap between elite decisions and the aspirations of the people.
Yeah, definitely. And perhaps in future transitions, real public participation will be prioritized, making constitutional reform not only a top-down imposition, but a truly inclusive, democratic journey.
That's the hope. The Cambodian experience, for all its flaws, still offers lessons for future constitution-making efforts in post-conflict societies. Lessons that remind us how crucial transparency, public engagement, and a balance of power truly are.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining this discussion. We've unpacked the intricacies, challenges, and the legacy of Cambodia's constitutional process, illustrating how peace, history, and the law are forever intertwined. Until next time.